Hello everyone, Angie here. Isn't it about time we started to really understand where this government and earlier governments have got it all wrong about the UK economy? That's what we will do today, so you can see what really needs to change and happen. Let's crack on. Do you know, for almost a century, all our governments, including Labour and Conservatives alike, have tried to control the economy using old-fashioned, out-of-date tools. That's right. But we must remember these originated in a very different time, when the world faced the Great Depression of the 1930s. Back then, economies collapsed. Jobs vanished and millions suffered. Economists like John Maynard Keynes offered ideas that made sense at that time and for decades afterwards. And for decades afterwards, they shaped government policy. But times have changed. The way money works, the way economies operate, and the challenges we face today are nothing like those of the 1930s. Yet our governments, including this Labour government, are still applying the same outdated methods. So, in this video, let's explore, number one, how Keynesian economies emerged, how modern monetary theory, or MMT, developed later in response to newer crises. 3, the key differences between the two. 4, why UK governments, both Conservative and Labour, still cling to old ways. 5, what will happen if Labour continues down this road? And finally, what must change if we are to build a thriving economy with full employment and a fairer economy for all of us for the future? Well, firstly, we need to look briefly at the Great Depression of the 1930s, which showed the world something shocking, and that was that economies could collapse and stay stuck at high unemployment for years. At the time, the orthodox economics of the day, what we now call neoclassical, said markets would always correct themselves. But they didn't, which is why Keynes, a British economist, challenged this view. And he argued that governments had to step in when private demand collapsed. He advised borrowing and spending to boost demand, thus creating jobs and pulling the economy out of recession. Now, Keynes created the cycle of government spending during downturns and then repay the debt during the booms. This was a breakthrough at the time, shaping policies during and after World War II, and for decades. It guided both our government and other governments across the world. So we see that Keynes saw money as scarce, believing governments were constrained by what they could borrow. Indeed, that assumption was true under the gold standard and fixed exchange rates. But the gold standard had gone by the 1970s, and the world has moved on. Let's fast forward to the late 20th century and our new world with modern monetary theory, MMT. So now economists began to look again at money itself. With the abolition of the gold standard, currencies like the pound and the dollar became fiat currencies. That means government-issued currency, backed not by gold, but simply by law, and modern monetary theory, or MMT, backed not by gold, but simply by law. And modern monetary theory, or MMT, grew out of this reality. It said, governments that issue their own currency, like the UK, cannot run out of money. Borrowing is not a financial necessity, but a choice. Bonds are simply savings accounts for the wealthy, not real funding. The true limit on government spending is not debt, but inflation. And inflation can be managed through taxation and policy. And most importantly, the government's role is not to balance its own books, but to balance the real economy, that is, jobs, resources, services, etc. Households and business can run out of money. Yes, they must earn before they spend, but governments that issue their own currency, like the UK, create the money we all use. So the government's job is not to balance its own books, no, but to balance the resources in the real economy. That means making sure we have enough doctors and nurses in the NHS, enough homes for families, enough teachers in schools, enough energy for the future. So whilst Keynes saw debt as a burden, modern MMT sees debt as private sector savings for the wealthy. Keynes focused on the traditional balancing budgets. MMT, though, focuses on balancing the economy, much more healthy. See, Keynes focused on borrowing and balancing the government's books, as I said. With MMT, debt is not a problem. It is the flip side of private savings, that's all. Keynes sees spending as needing to be limited until full employment to avoid inflation, whereas MMT, although acknowledging that inflation is real, it can be controlled by taxation and resource management. It also sees interest rates as too blunt and too slow a mechanism to control the economy. Keynesianism was revolutionary in the 1930s, but MMT reflects today's monetary reality. So the UK government are really living in the past. What about here in the UK? Have our governments thought about adopting this new approach? The answer is seemingly not. Both Labour and Conservative governments stick to the old narrative. They talk about balancing the books. They treat government debt like household debt. It's not. They act as though the government's job is to avoid upsetting the financial markets. It isn't. This was George Osborne's logic in 2010 with austerity. Great, wasn't it, during those times? It is Rachel Reeves' logic today when she promises that every pound of spending will be fully funded. It sounds sensible, but it blocks investment in the future. That's what we need. It leaves housing unaffordable, the NHS underfunded, and green energy delayed. And all because of an outdated theory. Yet we see how economic crisis proves the opposite. It proves the new approach. Here's the irony. When crisis hits, governments quietly behave as though MMT, modern monetary theory, is true. They really do. Look at the 2008 financial crash. Gordon Brown's Labour government spent massively to save the banks and the economy. The Bank of England created money, but we are told the story that the government was still borrowing for that spending. Not true. Next, look at the 2020 pandemic. Rishi Sunak's Treasury funded furlough, business support and healthcare on an unprecedented scale. Again, the Bank of England created the money. Nobody asked, where will the money come from at that moment? So both times this government action with MMT worked. Lives and jobs were saved. But as soon as the crisis passed, both parties rushed back to the old narrative. Time to tighten belts for the worse off, yes. Not for the better off, no. So the truth is this. Governments already use MMT-style tools in emergencies, and they work. But they refuse to adopt them in normal times. But do we think these are normal times? I hope not. Let's look at the danger of Labour's current path. So what happens if this Labour government continues with old Keynesian and monetarist ideas? Public services will remain underfunded. That's what. Always waiting for the money to be found. Housing shortages will worsen because large-scale investment is ruled out. Climate action will stall because Labour fears debt levels. Inequality will rise because the wealthy always find ways to save while the majority of us face cuts and higher taxes. Labour's approach is simply not designed for today's challenges. It is trying to apply a 1930s toolkit to a 21st century world. That is like trying to run a modern economy on steam power. So where does that leave us? We need honesty from our leaders. The government does not run like a household. It cannot run out of money in its own currency. Its responsibility is not to balance its own books, but to balance the economy, to ensure jobs, services and resources meet the needs of society, of all of us. That's the healthy approach. And that means recognising that deficits are not dangerous in themselves. It means understanding that inflation, not debt, is the real constraint. It means using fiscal policy boldly, investing in housing, green energy, healthcare and jobs. And above all, it means rejecting outdated theories that no longer fit the world we live in. Yes, Keynes helped us in the 1930s, but it is modern monetary theory that gives us the tools for today, and we must use them. If Labour continues to cling to the old ways, it will fail. It will let down the people who voted for change, and it will trap Britain in stagnation. But if we demand better, if we push for leaders who understand the real workings of our economy, then we can build a future of full employment, strong public services and shared prosperity. Don't let the wealthy bully the government to sticking to Keynesian ideas that suit just the very wealthy and not the rest of us. That choice really lies ahead of us, and it starts with understanding the difference between the old story and the new reality. Goodbye.